All right, perfect. So welcome everyone. Appreciate you all attending our third Internet2 Net Plus webinar series. I wanted to quickly introduce myself. I feel most of you know who I am, but just in case, my name's Leighton Spencer, and I work here at Google as a Google Workspace for Education specialist. Today we will be diving into storage management. I know that's something that's top of mind for a number of institutions, so we thought it was critical to get this early within the webinar series, so you all could kind of have the latest information there too. So hopefully you all find this session to be helpful, and we're going to be shedding some light on best practices and approaches you all can be implementing immediately. Right here we have the agenda. It's jam-packed as we go through our storage policy overview and timeline, tips on reporting that can be run, setting quotas and storage cleanup, as well as how you can approach storage management moving forward once initial cleanup is complete. General recommendations for users, aka change management, some very helpful takeaway resources as well, and then if time permits, a Q&A session towards the end. So if you do have questions, be sure to put them in the Q&A segment, which you can actually find within Meet by the different shapes that are to your right-hand side. It's the triangle, square, and circle. If you click on that, you'll see the Q&A section. So let's review the storage policy and timelines to keep in mind. So as I'm sure you all have heard, Google has changed our storage policy. Our no-cost fundamentals tier now offers a limit of 100 terabytes. This is enough storage for over 100 million Google Docs, 8 million presentations, or 400,000 hours of video. And if you have a lot of monthly active users in your domain, because you are a large institution, you will automatically receive additional storage for each user above 20,000 active users. There are also options to add additional storage as needed. Teaching and Learning Upgrade offers an additional 100 gigs for each license that is purchased. Education Plus licenses, both the paid and the free faculty licenses, offer an additional 20 gigs per license. And if you're on our legacy edition of Google Workspace for Education Plus, formerly known as G Suite Enterprise for Education, you will receive 100 gigs for each paid license. The free Legacy Plus licenses do not offer any additional storage, and those free ones would be the student licenses that came along with those legacy licenses. We also did want to provide you with an overview of which products consume storage within Google Workspace. So we see here that doc sheets, slides, and forms count towards storage, with the exception of doc sheets, slides, and forms older than May 2022. These will not count or consume storage unless they are edited after that May 2022 date. Videos, recordings, My Drives, and shared drives will also count towards storage for the domain. Gmail will also be included, as well as trashed items and spam items. And then lastly, Google Photos will also count towards storage. So this is for those individual users, as well as domain-wide. And I think one of the key pieces here to keep in mind is kind of the timeline and the journey that we've all been going through. So here you can see what that journey kind of encompasses, from the education stages to action to implementation. So Google had initially made this storage policy announcement change back in February of 2021, alerting all EDU customers that we will be planning to move away from an unlimited storage model in the name of sustainability and equity to a more pooled storage model that admins would have control over, being able to set policies and limits for their specific users. Quickly following that announcement, we were also announcing the new Workspace for Education editions. Google launched these new editions in April 2021, and that makes up the Google Workspace for Education new editions like Standard, the Teaching and Learning Upgrade, and Education Plus. The following year, in April 2022, Google released and announced the storage management tools that gave admins the ability to set limits for those individual users within your domain. And in May of 2022, new and edited native editors started counting towards storage, and admins had the ability to move shared drives into OUs. in June of 2022, an MSA was shared with the primary context for the domain of what your specific enforcement dates were. So that's something where you should always look back within the MSAs that you've received if you do have questions around what your specific enforcement date is. Or you can reach out to your Google representative who can share that with you. And then later in October of 2022, you now have the ability to create delegated storage admin roles within your admin console, as well as give shared drive IDs, surfacing that and making that available within the admin console. And to close out 2022 in December, admins then could create quotas via the OUs for shared drives. We also had a ton of announcements that happened earlier this year and releases that occurred revolving around storage. So in January 2023, the new progress bar launched in the storage section of the admin console. Shared drive default limits were launched at 100 gigabytes, and shared drive creation permissions were also launched with the default off at the root OU. Both the shared drive changes were enacted, and if your admin actually decided not to override those would be turned on for your institution. But admins did have that ability to override both of those shared drive settings if they saw fit. Lastly, Google also began the implementation of pooled storage limits on domains that did not have approved extensions. It is important to remember that this has been a process that is impacting hundreds of millions of domains and users. So if you have not yet seen those limits take place or take effect within your specific domain yet, it is likely to be set any day now. And those who have extensions, obviously, the dates that we've shared with you are the dates that that policy will take place. And then what we've seen for upcoming future dates for all domains to keep in mind, and to always remember to defer to your specific MSA that was sent in June 2022. And the subject line was reminder, prepare your domain for the Google Workspace for Education Pool Storage Policy Update, or you can reach out to your specific Google representative for more information on that. But for those with 3-year commitments of plus, you will have until May 2024 before pooled storage limits take effect. For those who have committed to 4-year contracts of Education Plus via the Internet2 Net Plus contract, you will have until November 2024 before those pooled storage limits take effect. Again, if you're unsure of your specific enforcement date, please reach out to your Google representative, and we're happy to obviously assist you and help with that. I think another piece here, that we wanted to obviously share is, and I highlighted on the last bar, or on the last slide, was the progress bar that had launched, is now available to all customers within the admin console. This was launched in January of this year and allows admins to see the total usage versus the pooled storage you have allocated or will have allocated. This does not mean your domain is currently being enforced in terms of the storage policy. And then something else to also keep in mind is that 30-day unique logins. For institutions that have more than 20,000 30-day unique users, you will receive an automatic additional 5 gigabytes for each user over that 20,000 user mark. Google will also be doing 6-month lookbacks on April 1st, which just passed, and October 1st. You will find your 30-day unique login report for the past 180 days in your admin console. So I would actually advise you all to potentially look within your admin console as well to see what your specific peak was for those 30-day active users. This is something just to keep in mind for your pooled storage quotas, especially for those who are already being enforced. I think an obvious piece, an important piece of this entire thing is what happens once the limits are being imposed and we exceed those limits. So here I'll actually be reviewing what happens if one of your users goes over the limit that you have set for them, or what happens if your domain goes over the limit. So let's start with the user. If a user goes over the limit you set for them, they are immediately impacted, which means they will lose the ability to upload new files or images to Drive, continue to back up new photos or videos to Google Photos, record new meetings on Google Meet, and create new edit, copy, or submit files within editors products like doc sheets and slides within Drive. They will, however, still be able to send and receive Gmails and can sign in and access their account to view and download files. The same repercussions occur for the domain as well, with the exception of a grace period that can be applied or will be applied. If the domain exceeds the limit by 25% or for longer than 14 days, whichever comes first, all users will face the repercussions that I just explained above. All users will still have access to their accounts to view and download from Drive, and you'll still be able to send and receive emails. And then in addition to these policy items and changes, we have also updated the banners that you will see within your admin console if you're a super admin role or a storage management admin role. And this is going to be based on your entire domain's storage usage. Some important items to remember or consider is when dismissing banners, they will disappear until the next threshold is met. Banners will reset if and when a domain drops below that 80% utilization number. And for domains that exceed after enforcement has taken place, you will have, and will read, you have X number of days to reduce your storage before a storage disruption. To get more storage, you will be redirected to our Help Center article on freeing up storage or purchasing additional storage through TNL upgrade licenses, plus licenses, or Workspace additional storage add-ons. And on the right-hand side, you'll see all the different banners that will appear for you. Both 80% utilization and 90% utilization banners are dismissible, while over 100% usage are not dismissible. I will now be passing things over to Ken, who's going to take us through the quota management pieces and the storage cleanup process pieces. So Ken, feel free to take it away.
Thank you very much, Leighton. I needed to unmute there, but let me take over so that I can do this all in one. Because I'm going to be jumping back and forth between demo and presentation. I just want to make sure, give it a few minutes before that comes up and make sure everybody can see my screen. Leighton, if you can give me a thumbs up that we're good. I think we're good. Okay. For those who don't know me, my name is Ken Matthews. I am the solutions engineer on the Workspace for Education team, specifically for higher education customers. So I've had many conversations with a lot of you, specifically around storage management, as well as many of the other topics that come across your desk and my desk. Today, we're going to dig into a very weighty topic. We have a lot of information to share. I'll try to get through it as simply and as quickly as possible because I want to give some time for those important questions. I see some coming in. I apologize if I don't answer them now. We are going to definitely have some time to be answering them at the end. I just want to make sure that we get through all of this information first before we dive into those. So many of you probably have already started to piece together what this storage management concept is as it relates to Google Workspace, and you probably find yourself thinking of it in 2 to 3 phases. The first phase being like, what do I have now? How can I report on it? How can I set policies? How can I clean up existing data to meet my deadline? The next one, how do I manage that storage long term? And the third phase would essentially be, how can I properly communicate these change management scenarios to my users who've been used to the wild, wild west for so many years, now that we're living in a more restricted environment. The first phase we're going to talk about is pretty much actions that we can do now, and that's going to be centered on the admin console tools. And it's essentially broken down in 3 parts as I see them. You can analyze and report on current usage within the admin console. There is more benefit to using the APIs that we'll see. You can enforce quota policies, define default policies on shared drives, as well as free up storage. And in the next slides here, we're going to talk about those in specific, and then we'll dive into some demos to be able to talk about that as well. So when we're talking about analysis, you may ask yourself questions around, how do I identify users using the most storage? How do I identify inactive accounts in my environment? How do I see how much storage my alumni users are taking up or my suspended users are taking up? Can I average out the usage across all of my active users? Can I investigate recent activity to get a sense of how active an account is? Same thing with shared drives, identifying the largest shared drives. Can I identify shared drives that don't have managers or members because those particular managers, members have left the university? Can I identify by creation date? Can I audit my membership permissions? Full disclosure, it probably is going to be easier to audit membership permissions via the API than it would be to be able to list that within the management console, admin console. But if you needed to in a pinch, you could potentially look at that information in the admin console as well as identifying recent activity with shared drives. Here are the tools that you're going to leverage within the admin console. At a high level, we have the storage management tools. You also have the ability to leverage existing reports, not only the user reports that you can pull, but you can also leverage the account reports as well. We have the ability to leverage the audit logs. We have some pre-built roles, custom admin roles, as well as pre-built admin roles that you can leverage to be able to delegate this out. And of course, if you need to do any of this at scale, you can do that using the APIs. You can do that with third-party tools such as GAM Advanced, and you can engage partners if you wanted to. Next, we have policy enforcement. You may be asking yourself, how can I define policies for particular groups over a standard quota? You can create those groups. You can set group policies for users. You can do the same at the staff and student OU, the alumni OU. You may have conversations within your environments about restricting access to certain services, such as Gmail only, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're not going to allow calendar or contacts or some of the other tools, tasks. All of those don't necessarily count towards storage, so you could still allow your users to utilize those. And then, of course, you're going to want to set that root OU level to protect your domain-wide storage for any out-of-band users that may be provisioned in that root OU for whatever reason. With shared drives, you can move shared drives into and out of OUs to be able to separate out those ones that are over a standard quota. I'm going to use the benchmark of 100 gigs because that's a default that we've recommended. We're also seeing, just so many of you know, that default 100 gig limit also helps in terms of what we're seeing in aggregate numbers as a good benchmark in terms of delineating the amount of shared drives that are using the most amount of storage in most of your university's environment versus the amount of shared drives that are related to the entirety of your corpus. So you may be able to use these tools to be able to separate those out and then run the API calls against just a smaller corpus of shared drives versus the entirety of the all shared drives within your environment. Set default quota at the root OU, and you can set default creation permissions. And here are the tools that you can use to do that. We're going to touch lightly on OU best practice management. Obviously, this is a decision that you can make within your environments. You can see what I have in my domain as something to look, measure up against. We can talk through some security group management to be able to manage your groups that may necessarily have particular quota settings or policy settings against, as well as access group management, access to particular items such as Google Photos in your environment while those users clean up. Again, we have those custom roles and pre-built admin roles and the third-party tools, the partners, to be able to leverage for anything at scale. And then the next question, the immediate question, is how do I free up? And a lot of this is going to be based on communicating with your users. You could potentially leverage the ability to set lower quotas to incentivize those users who are not answering those communications to be able to clean up. It will put Drive in a read-only state. Gmail will continue to work, but when they go into Drive or editors access items that are owned by those users, they won't be able to make those edits, and that could be incentive to be able to get that information off and clean up their data. I have heard this that there are admins out there, savvy admins out there in your university settings that are using drive labels as a way to expose files that are going away. Something that I think is really cool and something we'll dig into in the demonstration. And of course, if you delete those users or share drives, you're looking at restoring within 20 days or 25 days, and that vault data is removed. I'm going to quickly, since I mentioned vault, I'm going to quickly mention that when you delete those particular objects, the vault data is removed. If you delete the data within, the vault data remains, and that data will not count toward your storage if it's in vault but not in the users, in the user account or in the shared drive. All right, let us dive into some demonstration where we're going to start. Most of our conversations around storage is going to be in this storage management tool. You can see here, there is the ability to look at my top users, my top shared drives. I can start to set my quotas here, but we want to begin this analysis to understand what's going on in my environment, and it all starts with viewing your users. You're going to go to the user list. It's going to be pre-sorted by your top users. I'm going to turn off my camera for the time being because I have some autofocus functionality and I just want to focus in. That way you can just focus in on the demonstration here. As I said, it's going to be pre-filtered by these top users here. Let me just focus that out again. So I can see at the top, my top 50 users. I'm looking at rows, 50 rows here. I can see at my top 50 users. I have already set up a storage limit here, so I can see some banners on those. A lot of my users, this is a demo environment. This is not going to be what you see, but a lot of my users are currently over usage. This is because I wanted to ensure that I had actual data in my environment to be able to play with. And I can begin to scope this down. I can select by a particular OU if I wanted to. I can filter by status. So for instance, if I only wanted to look at suspended or active, I could also filter by storage status. If I only wanted to focus on those, if I did have limits set, if I only wanted to focus on those who are out of storage, less than, or 10% or 20%. And of course, I can download this user list to be able to download it into a Sheets or a CSV file. I can add more columns here that I want to. The ones that I'm particularly interested in are going to be the last sign-in and the storage information. And I'm going to download this information into a sheet or a CSV. It's important to note that the limit here is with the format that you're downloading into, not necessarily the download. Now, other reports you'll see have a limit in terms of the amount that you can download. But if I had Sheets here, that's 10 million cells. So if I had 8 columns, it would be 10 million divided by 8, give me the number of rows. Similarly, if I had 39, you would divide that 10 million cells by the number of columns, and it would give you the number of cells, the number of rows that you could potentially get. I've already created that download report, and I'm going to combine it with another report that has a lot of really useful information. And that is going to be the user reports under accounts. And the reason why I call this out is because there's actual activity that may be useful in terms of me understanding as an admin. What is going on with these users? How active are they? I will call out that this data here is 6 months, looks back 6 months. There are ways to be able to extend this data with some of the premium features, but that is something to note. If you want to pull the API for this data on a 6-month basis, repeated basis, you can get a better idea of what's going on if you have that time. But so of particular interest here are items like if I have IMAP or POP enabled, maybe I want to see the last time that was interacted with, last time somebody had interacted with the web sign-in, last time the drive was interacted with, last time docs was interacted with. All of this information would be available to you, and you can then pull that information into a report that you see here. I've pulled and combined both the user report as well as the accounts report so that I can see important information in terms of who the user is, what organizational unit they're in, whether or not they're active or suspended, whether or not information in terms of when they last signed in, which may not necessarily line up with any of the other active data that you see, all of their storage information that I can all filter in because I'm working within Sheets, and of course, all of this activity data that I can begin to filter. I can also begin to pivot and create a pivot table of averages in terms of by OU, what's the average storage in an OU here. I've done some calculations to be able to take that information, convert it into MB, and then I've done some calculations to convert it into GB. This data that you see here is completely inflated. It's not in a real use case, but you can see here, I guess maybe my staff is using 56. The average usage in my staff is 56 gigs. So maybe I want to set a 25 or 30 gig limit there if I wanted to. And that gives me a good sense of how I want to set policy going forward. Next, though, I may still have some questions around user activity because 6 months is not a lot of time. I could potentially leverage BigQuery logs, and we'll see a little bit later, to be able to push that out. But if I just wanted to see, just regular activity in the account, I could leverage the audit and investigation tool. Now, it's important to note that fundamentals users don't have as much flexibility with the audit investigation tool and the audit logs as secure as those that are on Plus or Standard. You're going to have the ability to create reports, activity rules with the investigation tool for Plus and Standard users. You can pivot off of data, so I can look at data within users, pivot to drive log events based on that user list. So it's really useful in terms of the functionality when you have a standard, when your admin has a Standard or Plus license. So some items that I may be interested in looking at here in terms of activity would be, I could go into, if I wanted to see the OAuth log events for my particular users, I could decide to add a condition here where I'm looking at actors within a particular organizational unit. So if I was interested in my student OU or my staff OU, I could start out with that, and I could group results by event if I wanted to, just see some aggregate data to start out with as I'm beginning my investigation. I can see some API calls, some grants and revokes, and then I could decide to create another investigation with those two conditions and the condition here to be able to search for that and get some information that I can export out to be able to see. Now, some of this information may not necessarily be user specific. You may see some information as the service account or admin account that is working on behalf of the user if you're using the APIs within your environment. But this could be information, good information to be able to pull out, export, look into to get a better sense of what's going on here. You also have the ability to look at certain events around, I was wondering if that would happen in my environment where my session timed out. It wouldn't be a demo if your session didn't time out. But you also have the ability to look at drive log events. What I want to look at here, because I think this may be useful, if you're just looking at quickly, you want to see some information around suspended users. You can choose the suspended user is true, so suspended ID is true condition. You can search for that, and this is where I'm talking about that flexibility, where I can take this primary email here, and I can use that to be able to pivot to drive log events, where these particular users are owners of any items. They're the owners of those particular items, and I can begin to search either group by event to see those particular events, or I could just search outright. I'm not going to have any items here, but you will see a number of items here, and just so you can see it specifically, let's discard this search here, and we're going to go back and we're going to say false, because I have more information with users that are not suspended. But imagine these are suspended users, and I wanted to then pivot to those drive log events where these particular users, as you can see, I have 100 unique values here, and I wanted to group those results by event here. And I can see if these were suspended users, I could begin to see a number of activities that are related. One particular item that might be interesting is views. Who's viewed items that those particular users have owned. Now, again, this only goes back 6 months. There are implications around research data that's been living around for 10 years, but this is something to give you to leverage, to give you some detail in terms of that 6-month window, to give you a sense of how active or not active an account is. It is also important to note that you can do one other thing here where you can see how active a particular shared drive is, and we're going to look at drive log events here, and I'm going to essentially go to the condition of owner, and this plays on the idea of the university being the owner of those shared drives, does not contain the domain that I am in, and I can essentially group results by event to see that aggregate data first. If I didn't want to do that, I could remove that, but it's going to take a minute for this to come through. This will be events on, these are all the various events as it relates to shared drive, just so you can see that, so you don't think I'm lying. If I do a general search and we look at the owner column here, we're actually going to scroll down here. You can actually see that most of these owners here are actual shared drives within my environment. I have a massive shared drive that I have in my environment. So that's really useful in terms of some quick, dirty investigation in terms of what's going on in your environments. Next, we're going to go back to where we all started, and we're going to start setting, I've analyzed my data, we're going to set those policies. And this is where you go into the storage settings under managed. And you have two options here. You can set the user storage limit, the shared drive storage limit. For users, you can set it by group or OU. For shared drives, you can only set it by OU. So the order in which this should happen, if you haven't set your limits already, is for users, start with the group for those out-of-band users over that standard limit. Go to your sub-OUs for your staff and students, then set a limit at the root OU. Similar with the shared drives, you're going to want to set it at the sub-OU levels first, and then set it at the root OU. If you have specific shared drive OUs that you want to create, that is up to you. You can do that as well. I have not done that. I've just allowed it to be created within the staff and student OUs here. But in this particular instance, I have some policies, and this is just for visibility. You don't have to name these because I do understand that these particular groups, if members are members of these particular groups, they will see these, and maybe you don't want to expose that to your users, that if they go into their group settings, they can see that they're part of a group that is giving them an idea of how much storage they have outside of the limit that they see anyways. So you can set any naming convention you want. I've just done this for visibility. You also want to go into the API and make sure that your group members can't remove themselves from that group, and that's only available via the API. So definitely be sure when you've set up these groups and you've added your users, make sure you go in and ensure that those users can't remove themselves from it, because that could be a potential issue. They would no longer have, well, they would have the domain, they would have the limit at the OU. So if you set a lower OU limit, at least you would be protected. Of course, it's really simple. You turn it on based on the group here. You set your limit based on what you decided. You can choose to unset that limit here if you want to, and that would remove the group from this priority list. How you order this is going to be how those priorities are going to cascade down. So if a user was a group member for all of these particular groups, the user would get the 2 terabyte because that is the priority. If you didn't believe yourself when you did that, you could type in Alex Hudson here, which is the user that I'm going to be using today, and you can see that they are getting something that's inherited from this 2 terabyte. You can also see quickly where they are in relation to that limit that you set. Groups are done. We're going to move into OUs for the users. We're going to go into the organizational units here, and we're going to choose our staff. We're going to set our limits for our staff at 25 here. And I want to set 500 gigs for the shared drives that are created within the staff OU. In this particular demonstration, I'm allowing shared drives to be created in these particular OUs. You'll see a little bit later how you can set that up. You can obviously create your own shared drive specific OUs if you want, and set separate policies based on the tier of sizes if you want. Students OUs, I'm going to go in there. I'm going to set some limits here as well. I can also go into the students. If I have a separate alumni, I could set some limits there as well. And then once that's done, definitely go back to the root and set your limits, lower limits here. I'm very restrictive, you'll see, for my shared drive creation. Which is what we would recommend within reason. So I've adopted this 100 gig limit across, except for the staff OU for my shared drives. And that's going to be in a nutshell in terms of how you set your limits for your shared drives and users in your environment. But there is some other implications here that we want to look at, and that's going into the drive settings themselves and looking at the sharing settings for how shared drives are created in my environment. And these are default settings. So if you have thousands of shared drives already out there, these settings will not affect those shared drives. These are all for newly created shared drives moving forward. I always recommend going with a combination of groups and OUs. It's just going to be easier to be able to get a little more fine-grained with groups, but you also want to leverage some OU policies as well. In this particular instance, if I'm looking at this particular setting here, I must select it. I have a policy shared drive creators group, and they are allowed to create, those particular users are allowed to, I have to select it, but those particular users are allowed to create it. So this is actually saying, if you check it, you prevent users from creating. If you uncheck it, you allow users to create. And I've also chosen that those creators can create groups, and it will be stored in their organizational unit. So if it is a staff member, that will be stored in the staff OU. If it is a student member, it will be stored in the student OU, or if there are other sub-OUs in there, they will be stored there as well. You can also select specific organizational units and make those changes if you want to. I've also allowed these particular creators to have management access, as well as the ability to change all of these settings down here, which is essentially security settings to ensure that your data stays within your university. If you want to allow external sharing, think about the implications about that, but if you wanted to, you can allow that within your environment. You can allow users to share directly on files as well as on folders, content managers to share folders. You can also allow viewers and commenters to download, print, and copy. I'm turning these defaults off for now. So it'll be, these creators can always go in and change that, or the admins within the environment can change that. If you want it to be super restrictive, you can turn this off and only make it the admins who can do that. It's purely up to how you want to design this in your environments. And of course, once that's all said and done, I am just going to create a root OU level and inherit it all the way down policy where essentially nobody in my environment who's not part of that group can create share drives. And all of this doesn't really matter because they're not going to be able to do any of that activity anyway. So it's just going to be scoped to that specific group of people. Let me just take a look at my notes, make sure that, yes, so that's essentially how you would set policies on shared drives moving forward. Those are the defaults. Some other things to call out would be around whether or not do I want to enable takeout, and takeout has actually moved under account now. Do I want to enable takeout in my environment? And there are two options for education users. Do I enable it for download, or do I enable it for transfer? I like to, again, when it comes to additional services, I like to have access groups and leverage access groups. You may find organizational units, if there's a broader scope of people, to be a better source to set this policy against. But in this particular instance, I've created an access group called Google Photos. Let's go into the ability to turn on or off takeout. I've created an access group for takeout specifically, and I've allowed those users in that group to have access to Google Takeout, that download option. This is not the transfer option, it's just the download option. And then there are specific settings for individual services that you see here as well. So if I have photos users and they need to be able to take out photos using the takeout tool, they don't want to use partner sharing or any of the other ways, download directly, I can scope that to an access group as well and decide to turn it on for that particular group. And that will give everybody in that group access to it, and then I can then turn it off for all of my OUs. And that way I know based on membership who has access to these particular tools. You can do a similar model for your additional services if you want to, purely up to you, just something that just helps keep me organized in terms of how I look at it. And then finally, yeah, that is, we're up on terms of setting policy within your environment to move forward. And next, it's going to be, how do I free up that storage? And there are a number of implications and things that we can do there. First off, you can simply go into the users list here, and you can choose to select, I have a particular offboarding OU of staff and students. This is a staging OU before I decide to suspend them, for instance. I'm going to choose my staff here, and Alice is saying goodbye. So I want to, maybe I don't want to suspend this user in this particular instance, but maybe they're in the suspended OU. And I want to just go through the option of deleting, removing those licenses first, and then deleting that user. Although if I delete the user, the licenses will be removed, of course. But I want to delete this select user here, and I have a few options here to be able to transfer their Gmail data, for their messages. You can see all the recommendations that we're making. You can choose to transfer all of this data that's listed here, or not transfer. Something to call out here for Drive and Docs. Do you or do you not want to include files that are not shared with anyone? This does not necessarily mean that unchecking this option, there may be a folder that's shared with a bunch of people, but there may be items within the folder that's not shared with anyone. Those items may actually be transferred as well. But on the whole, you may not want to check this. You may not want to move all of that data over for your users. This is one option to be able to transfer data on deletion. Another option would be able to go into the apps under Workspace, under Drive and Docs, before you delete the user, and look at transfer ownership. And this would just be specific to Drive. So you can type in from a particular user that's leaving the institution to a particular user that's staying, and the ownership will transfer over. The original owner will still have edit access, but if they're leaving, it doesn't necessarily matter. But this is something that you can leverage. Next, you can go back to the, we've talked about what we can do in terms of the admin console for our users. We can go back into the storage tool to be able to view our shared drives. Again, I want to be completely honest here. I recognize the limitations with this view. There are probably a number of items here that we can improve upon. We are continuing to improve upon. I'm just going to call out what you can do here. And I think the biggest thing that you can do is you can begin to move these shared drives 50 at a time. You can also do this via the APIs. You can move these shared drives that are over a specific set amount, and I have set some limits here. I can choose these particular items here, and I can decide to select all or select the ones that I want, and I can change that organizational unit. And why would we want to do that? Maybe you have a corpus of 50,000 shared drives, and 2% of those shared drives are essentially over that 100 gig limit. If you moved those 2% of those shared drives into a separate OU, you can actually run some API calls against those particular shared drives, not the entirety of your corpus, to be able to clean up those short term while we continue to develop the tools long term to make it easier for you to manage this and report on this in the future. You also have a number of filters that you can apply here. If you want to look at anything created over, let's say, 6 years ago, and you want to blow those out, you could potentially do that if that's your policy. If you have items that have somehow been abandoned with no managers or no members, you can take a look at those. You can sort here by the number of items. Maybe you want to look at ones that are showing 0 KB. You look at the item cap, it shows 0%. This is a percentage. It's 400,000 items that are stored in a shared drive. So you'd have to do some math to understand what 1% would be. It's essentially 4,000 items. So if you saw 0%, but you saw some usage, it's probably going to be between that 1 and 4,000 item cap limit there. It's just not going to be reflected in terms of percentage. And if I selected what I want to select and I want to delete those, I can delete those 50 at a clip. You will see some status changes here. You can see the ones that are active, the ones that are deleted, they will stay in that deleted status for 25 days, and the ones that are disabled. Disabled essentially means that there were some terms of service violations. That may be something you want to look at to see if that's actually active in your environment. You could add yourself. I believe you can still access those in a read-only state. You can add yourself to it to be able to see what's going on in there and delete it as you see fit. You also have you can view managers, you can view settings. Probably all of that is better via the API. I would make a call out here. This is not necessarily something that we, Google, can recommend, but I know that there's some university admins, savvy admins out there that have leveraged the ability to scrape this particular view to be able to pull the data. That's probably going to be much easier than the APIs, using some form of an extension web scraper. There are many out there. I'm also engaging some internal folks here to be able to see if we can't open source something to help make your lives a little easier while we navigate this new world. So look for more updates on that, or reach out to your account reps to find some more information on that. And let's just dive back into a couple of other things that we can do that I want to call out. Just let me do a quick time check to make sure we're good. Okay, we've still got about 30 minutes. I want to give some time to some Q&A. But I do want to call out that there's some really cool options within Drive that just, in terms of how to be able to navigate conversations with your users. One of those options is migration settings. Just to note, you may have some users that are suspended. They're no longer, listening to they're no longer viewing those emails communications. They're no longer with the university, but they own all of these files. But there's a number of active editors on those files, and you would want to check this so that those editors can move items into shared drive. There may be some university-owned specific data that needs to be lived in a university-owned shared drive. You want to check this to make sure that they can do that so that you're not doing that for them. Another particular option to call out here, especially for those users who are very concerned about the My Drive, how My Drive looks and what they have in their My Drive, and maybe they're transferring from domain to domain. You want to leverage shared drives to be able to transfer that data. Maybe you have a particular instance where an alumni domain, somebody is moving to the alumni domain from a production domain, and you want to leverage shared drives and retain all of those IDs. You could potentially do that. But something to call out is you need to make sure that your settings are as least restrictive as possible, which means you have to allow external sharing, and something down here is distributing content outside of the university that you're at. You'd want to set this to anyone. Now, word of caution, you don't want to do this across the board, but you may want to do this at the OU or group level. And it's important to note when you click on Learn More, This does mention shared drives owned by other organizations or my drives owned by other organizations. So essentially, I believe I've tested this, test and confirm. You might be able to leverage my drives for consumer accounts here in this particular instance. For those special cases, not something that you would want to do more broadly, but something that you could potentially leverage to be able to distribute data a little bit easier than, say, Takeout or something like that. Something just to call out. And then finally, we have labels. If you want to start, and if you're a premium customer with Plus or Standard, and you want to start managing labels, you have to turn those on. And when you do turn those on, and I'm going to just blow this up a little bit more so you can see, you have the ability to set some labels, and there is one badged label, which might be handy if you want to announce to users that particular files are going away. And then you have up to 149 standard labels that you can create, and this could be potentially used as a search chip within the user's drive. So if you've exposed the visibility of these to your users, they don't have to have a license to see it. They do have to have a license to be able to set it. You could potentially do that. How that looks in this particular instance here, and I'll just dig into this, is you can see this badged label. You can put in a label description outlining what is going to happen to this particular in this particular option. Maybe I'm going to be deleting some items here. I've been using this badge label for other things like setting up against DLP, so ignore the tip the swear jar as well as the confidential items here. But you could set a particular badged label option here as to be deleted, and then you can go in once you've published that and set the permissions. You can say everybody in the university can view this label, and then you can create a specific group and permission those users in the group to be able to apply and set values. Those particular users would need to have a license to be able to do that. Once that's set up, you'll see a little bit later in the demonstration, you can begin to leverage these particular tools to be able to expose files that are being deleted to your users long term. Let's see where I'm at. Yes, speaking of long term, let's just go back into the item and get into the second phase of storage management, and that is, do we have any items that we can do we have any tools that can begin to help me manage storage long term? But before we do that, I want to let Leighton take some time to talk to you about how you can purchase more storage.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ken. Some super valuable information there. But yeah, let's dive into a couple of the options that you all have to purchase additional storage. So I think this is one place just to get started as understanding the pricing options that are available for Internet2 Net Plus customers for those additional storage options. So these options, of course, will be current prices that are available until December 1st of this year. And I believe most of you are aware of this, but just kind of highlighting them. Adding Plus licenses grants you an additional 20 gigabytes of storage per license. This includes the 4 paid licenses and 1 free ratio as well. I know many of you are aware, when you purchase 4 paid student licenses, you receive 1 free staff plus license. Both those license types offer an additional 20 gigs. Each commitment period also offers additional discounting for Internet2 Net Plus customers. So whether it's 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years, that's where those are automatically added. And your price is kind of locked in at that. Another option that is available for adding storage for fundamentals or standard customers is adding teaching and learning licenses. These are priced at $48 per user per year and provide an additional 100 gigabytes per license. They can be purchased a la carte, so that is why they have a slightly higher price threshold. But they can be really useful for addressing smaller additional storage needs within your domain, especially for those who are on standard or those who remained on fundamentals. We've received kind of licensing options, or reviewed licensing options in the first session, and the recording will be posted on the Internet2 Net Plus webinar registration page here shortly. But if you do have any questions, please contact your representative at Google, and they can answer any of these as well. And then the last option that we have for adding storage within the Workspace environment is Workspace Additional Storage SKU. The MSRP on this is $3,600 for 10 terabytes per year. You can buy as many of these additional storage packs as you need. And the SKU amount is added to the shared pool of storage. So, you know, if you buy 20, 30, 40 terabytes, that is added to the pool. And then you as an admin can actually assign those as you see fit as well. Plus customers get an additional 50% discount on that MSRP price. And Plus customers that purchase through Internet2 Net Plus will get a 60% discount on that MSRP price. So next up, Ken is going to be running us through some strategies to managing storage in the long term, but this is just one of those pieces with the pricing options that are available to you all once kind of that storage policy is being enforced for your domain.
Thank you, Leighton. So yes, managing long term, here's potential options that you can have. I want to give some time, so I may rush through this, and I do apologize. We can always have individual calls to be able to talk through, but I want to make sure that I get to these questions. But if you're on fundamentals, you could revisit your Vault custom retention rules. You could scope those retention rules to Gmail, potentially shared drives, if your compliance policies allows, something that you may want to look into. You can also leverage Gmail compliance rules, email compliance rules, as well as potentially leveraging AppScript. I'm going to show briefly one thing that you can do in terms of blocking send and receive for those alumni accounts. In terms of emails, you could also potentially leverage compliance rules to ensure that emails from and received to alumni accounts have to adhere to a certain message size. So if you were afraid that attachments would blow out an account and there's no way to be able to block that, you could use compliance rules in that way. And if you have some developers on staff, maybe you want to do an upgrade to helping your users understand what's going on with Drive, and you can develop some internal applications that don't have the same restrictions in terms of publishing those as extensions, or maybe even Sheets-based AppScript applications, to be able to help your users manage storage or organize storage, so they can essentially leverage the APIs to pull information. And you can push those out on an internal basis, not necessarily publicly, if you wanted to, leveraging these particular native tools. Standard and Plus users can definitely use BigQuery usage and activity reports. I'd highly recommend you start digging into this if you have not already. There's a lot of useful information in there. If you're pulling information from the reports API, and you may need to still do that for some instances, but you want to begin to offload that into BigQuery, you could do that. One particular item where this comes useful is you can monitor storage usage over time. So if you wanted to look at actual graphs over a year versus 6 months, you can begin to build that out so you can get a sense of how storage is growing in your environment. You could also look at activity owned by specific suspended accounts over time, not something that may be useful now in terms of 6 months. We saw that with the investigation tool, but it might be something that you can do if you have logs going back 2 years to get a sense of what I should and should not move over into a shared drive. You can build activity rules, for instance, and build security dashboards, as well as, and it's not here yet, but it will be here for education customers, the advanced domain-wide takeout, and we'll dig a little bit into that in our demonstration so you can see how that looks. But let's go back into the demo environment to begin to pull this out so you can see what I'm talking about. And I'm just going to close out some windows here. And we're going to start with compliance rules. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but this is actually not something that I personally developed, but I've had conversations with people on my team who've developed. I believe I shared this out with the Internet2 community, and some members have actually come back and improved this. I love that knowledge sharing, open source attitude in which we want to improve upon ideas. But this is a Sheets-based app script that's running, that's essentially saying I want to look at users over a specific quota in this particular OU, and I'm going to add them into this group. And just to give you a sense of what that looks like, there are three various scripts that are running. One is listing the users. One is getting the users based on that particular list, based on a quota amount that I set. I want to up this from 10 megs to, say, 10,000 megs. And then I'm going to sync those particular users into a group that I'm going to use in terms of a compliance rule. And how that essentially looks is, if I go into Gmail settings here and I go down to the compliance rules, and I've actually set this up already for my students. So I want to select that particular OU. This could be your alumni OU, for instance. And I see I want to block sending and receiving. There are two separate rules that I could do this with. I'm going to edit this so you can see what it looks like. But it's going to apply to all inbound and outbound, both internal and external messages. And I'm going to be very liberal in terms of what I'm looking for in the header and body. I'm just looking for an @ symbol, which is 99.99999% of all emails, if not 100% of all emails going into the environment. And I am setting up a custom message that says, hey, this user is sending this message to the user who is over storage, and I'm letting that sender know that this user is over that storage limit. They must remove storage to be able to continue to send and receive email. So now I, as a sender, can reach out to that user and say, hey, did you know you're over storage? And they could say, oh, yeah, okay, I'm going to clean up. Next, I'm going to show some options here. There is a particular bypass setting. So the received rule will block the send rule, will block the received rule. In order to get those bounce notifications, you have to create a list. You can pull that information from the bounce notification, put that in that list, and bypass that for this particular rule so that one rule doesn't block the other. You're going to apply this to your users, and then you're going to set it specific to everybody within this over storage group. So it's only those users who are over storage. Now, this is leveraging the APIs, and there is a lag in the APIs. So you may see users that are over storage for 2 to 3 days, but are not in the group. And you may see users that were over storage, got under for 2 to 3 days, and are still in the group. So that's just something to call out with this particular tool, but you could use it as a way to be able to manage this and at least have some modicum of a roadblock. Similar thing for the blocking email received. This is blocking email sending. So if I, as a user, am over and I want to send a message, I'm going to get a message that says, you cannot, because you're over storage, clean up your storage. In this in particular instance, I do not need to bypass the setting for a particular list, but I do want to scope it to users, and I do want to scope it to this overage group. And that will be applied to all of my students in this particular instance, but you could apply it to your alumni domain if you have alumni in that particular instance. It's also worth noting that you could, and I'll just go in here so you can see, you could potentially leverage, instead of the advanced content match, you can potentially leverage a metadata match, and you can go into message size, and you could set a limitation in terms of what users can send and receive in terms of attachments. So if I wanted to limit this to, say, 5 megs instead of the standard 25 megs that's available with Gmail, you could potentially do that as an option, purely up to you if you want. That's one thing that you can do with the tools as they exist today. Another thing is going to be BigQuery logs, and you may be asking yourself, if you haven't already set it up, where do I set it up? And that would be under the reporting here on this section, and you're going to see the BigQuery export. And this is a 3-phase process. I'll click on this so you can see. You're going to go to GCP. You're going to create your BigQuery project that's related to BigQuery specifically. You're going to reference that project here back in the workspace side. You're going to create your data set. Now, I enabled this back when we were called G Suite, so that's why you see G Suite data export. And then you can set that to be specific to a certain geographic location. Once that's done, you can actually access the data directly from the workspace, and it'll take you to BigQuery logs here. And this is where you can begin to play with the logs. How this looks, essentially a tree. I have a bunch of saved queries here. But I have my export, I have my activity, I have my usage, soon to be Gmail if it hasn't already happened within your environments. But just so you can see what this looks like, if I'm looking at my activity table, these are all the schema, the fields that you have available. So if I was interested in Drive specifically, there's a bunch of data here that is also mirrored in the APIs that you can begin to leverage. So if you didn't want to manually pull the data, it could just be ingested in on a daily, on a periodic basis. Some of this data will be near real time. I believe we announced that back in December of last year, where it'll be about 10 minutes for some data. So this is super useful. Same thing for domain usage. If you wanted to begin to develop the similar reports that you see within the admin console, you could do that using these particular tools and running some queries and then building off of those queries with connected sheets or Looker Studio. As an example here, I have a query where I want to look at Drive events for, so I'm looking at a Drive doc ID, a Drive doc title, an event name, a Drive owner. I want to see who the owner of that particular item is, because I only want to look, and this is going to be in the activity table. I'm only looking at Drive records, and the Drive owner is going to be listed as a suspended is true or suspended user within the usage. So I'm essentially pivoting, as I did in the investigation tool, but with a query to be able to process this information. In the presentation that we have, there will be some documentation that will help you understand what the cost will be. There's a 10 terabyte query limit and a 10 gig storage limit for the free users. But you can see here, if I run this query, it's going to give me an instance of how much that's going to cost. I don't have a lot of data in my domain, so it's much lower than you would assume. But that particular free tier is pretty generous in terms of even for large domains. So I haven't heard of users go crazy in terms of doing this. There's also some best practices to ensure that you don't query all of your data. You can limit that data. So I'm ready to run this. I'm going to run this, and you can just quickly see what that looks like. Once it is run, I'm going to look at the results here just quickly, and you can see that I've surfaced a bunch of doc IDs. Maybe these particular doc IDs going back over 2 years could be put into a connected sheets. I can explore that data into connected sheets here. And then I can use another column to be able to build a GAM command off of and run that GAM command using connected sheets, or reference that particular sheet in my GAM command to be able to pull this information and migrate to a shared drive if I wanted to, after I've communicated with my users. Another thing, I fully admit that I stole this from some of the communications on our Internet2 workspace channel, but you can also look at activity in terms of, and I'll run this quickly so you can see, you can look activity in terms of last IMAP time, POP time, access, SSO time, as well as interaction within classroom, within docs, last login time. You can pull that information, explore that data into Looker Studio, and you may find, and I did this in 15, 20 minutes, I'm sure all of you may be able to make it look better. I'm going to continue to iterate on this, but you may find you can create reports using Looker Studio. And in this case, I have a user storage report. I have not selected any users here, but so this is all of my domain-wide data looking over the past year. I could decide to look at data looking over the last year if I wanted to, and that data will change. I can choose particular items here in terms of users. If I wanted to look at a specific user using that drop-down list, I can hover over and see what are the totals for the domain-wide here. I could go to this table, which lists all my users, and I can select a particular user here, and it'll change that surface here to give me a sense of what's going on. I can also look at activity in the same window if I wanted to. So if I wanted to look at last login time, this probably doesn't have a login date. Yep, 1970. I knew I was going to choose one that never had a login date. But all of this is useful information long-term that you can begin to leverage if you are interested. Next, we are going to want to look at advanced domain-wide takeout. I know probably many of you, I'm just going to do a quick time check. I think I can get through this. Enterprise education customers don't have access to this now. It will come Q2. It has already been announced, so I can say that. You don't have to have an NDA to be able to sign an NDA to be able to know that. But it will be coming to education, as I am told by the PMs. And this is going to allow you to take advanced domain takeout, which has traditionally been the entirety of all of your data in the entire domain, which is limited to 1,000 users, unless you want to go to support to be able to have them help you with a larger domain, to be able to scope this to OU. So this is an enterprise domain. I may have to log in again. Let's see. Yep. So this is actually a business domain. It's on enterprise. This is available for enterprise. This particular functionality will only be for plus and standard users. But I can start my export, and you can see here I can name my export, and I can export all data, or I can choose to scope that to a particular organizational unit or a group. So if I had an organizational unit of, say, 1,000 users that I wanted to pull this information out, or a group, I could do that. I can add that organizational unit, let's say alumni. Before I delete those users, I want to have some modicum of assurance that I have the data to access if I need to. I will stress this is not a backup option. It is just one option. If you want to do a backup option, maybe use a third-party service to back up data, such as I believe AFI is one, or maybe a SysCloud or a couple of other options to be able to back up data. It would be a more robust backup tool. But if you wanted to take out data using this option, you could, and then you could freely delete it from your accounts. How this will look essentially is, this is probably an older UI because this is actually my education domain, but I can go into the actual Google Cloud Storage bucket. It will be a temporary bucket, so it's only going to be live for 30 days. There are some GAM commands that, some resources that I shared in the presentation that will allow you to move that data from a temporary bucket into a one that you particularly own. But this is how it essentially looks here. I have a status report that I can access here. Under the authenticated URL, I can see some information in terms of what did and did not work. I also have the ability to go back and I can see specific data as it relates to particular users in my environment. As you can see here, particular resources, and those resources would be shared drives in my environment. Customer-owned data, that's things like chats, that's things like calendars. The resource will go through a lot of it, but you can see here that you can do a number of things here. So if I was looking at a particular user here, I can see that they have a number of MP4 files that I've exported. I can give them access. So if it was research data, I can give them access based on the URL. I could download it directly to a local storage. It's not going to be as user-friendly as, say, Drive, but it is an option. It's going to be similar. How it looks here is going to be similar how it look into a GCS bucket that you own there. Next, we're just going to go dive directly into, and I'm going to lightning round this one. Let's just dive directly into the third phase, and that's change management for your users. Essentially, it is going to come down to communication around how do I clean up data in my drive and the various permission mappings that are available in my drive that have existed for years, and how do I begin to communicate to users that university-owned data may go into or should go into, or if you would like to go into shared drives. Some things to call out, and I'm going to quickly go through this. As we all know, data in my drive may or may not be owned by that particular user. If that user creates it, it will be owned by that particular user. Obviously, they could share that out and it could be owned by other users, but in most cases, maybe not most cases, some cases it would be owned by them, and they could transfer that data if they want to another user or move it to shared drives with new user folder moves that has recently come out. You're going to want to communicate to your users that they ensure that they either organize or delete any duplicate or stale data prior to using takeout. You don't want to bring anything over that you don't need. Same thing, you want to target larger files for download directly from Drive. You may want to delete that outright prior to using takeout. Leverage those search operators, advanced search options to be able to target specific data. Do I need to be storing videos? Do I need to be storing images? And review access under shared with me, especially if they're using the takeout transfer option. You may decide not to enable that in your environment, but if you do enable it, users need to understand that the data in shared with me is also coming with them if they transfer the drive data. So it's best to be able to review that access, remove themselves from files, remove themselves from group membership that gives them access to those files. So that they're not bringing data over that they shouldn't necessarily need to. If you don't want your users to make that decision, you can make that decision for them, but just something to call out. Shared drive adoption, it's important to note that this is owned by the university. The data will remain even if the users are deleted. These are waterfall permissions, so what that essentially means is if they are a member, they can see all files and folders. There's no way to stop inheritance at the folder level. Maybe you want to create another confidential shared drive and create shortcuts to that data in the main shared drive. Individual file and folder access can be granted to non-members. Content managers now can share folders, and user folder moves will allow users to be able to migrate that data into shared drives much easier, keeping that folder directory intact without having to lose. Now, there are some caveats to this. I don't think we have time to get into it today, but there's some helpful documentation that walks through the 10% or 25 items, the lower of the two, in terms of the unmovable items. Google Photos, the users do need to delete that data. It will not delete on its own. If they decide to download the data, they have to go through the second option, so make sure that they understand that. There are, as we saw, separate takeout controls for photos. I've run into this. This probably goes without saying, but this has happened. Users have deleted data before it is downloaded. Same thing when we're talking about transferring the data. They've deleted it before it's downloaded. These are copies. So obviously, if the copy doesn't exist before the transfer completes, then they won't be able to have that data, and then it becomes an issue if they get outside of that restore window. Partner sharing could be leveraged, but again, you want to make sure that the users understand that they have to save it in the consumer account before they delete it on the workspace side, just to ensure that that data is saved. And you may have users that are not showing any storage in photos, and that's probably because they haven't done anything with anything that was stored in Storage Saver or Express Quality before 6/1/2021. So you'll turn off storage or photos, and all of a sudden you'll get help desk tickets saying, whoa, I don't have access to my photos anymore. So maybe create an access group, and as those things come in, you can add those members to the group so they can access and download that data. Again, takeout is copies. It is not the actual original items. So they want to make sure that the transfer or the export is done before they delete. Sometimes those transfers fail if the items don't have the permissions that are needed to make those copies. So if that particular option doesn't allow download, copy, or print, you want to turn that off. Takeout services, you may want to consider for the transfer service, maybe you would just want to scope it to Gmail. Tell your users use it for Gmail, but don't use it for Drive. Maybe you want to download that items directly. Same thing with the download option. Maybe you don't want to do the entirety of all of the data that you have across all of the services. Maybe you just want to start with photos, move to Drive, and then do all of the services outside of that. This way you can begin to scope any errors that may occur. I am aware, everybody's aware, I continue to make noise about this. The monitoring and / error reporting on this is light. It is not as specific as it should be, so I'm just thinking through ways to be able to isolate any errors as it relates to a particular service. And what I've heard, based off of what many of you have been telling me, is that if you want to use takeout transfer for Drive specifically, maybe use it for accounts that are heavy with our native files. So they're transferring just those native files to a consumer account. When it starts to break down as if they have a large corpus of data, a lot of data that is PDFs, images, videos, maybe not leverage that particular option for transferring, maybe go to the download option either directly from Drive or using that download option in the takeout service. And we have roughly 3 minutes, so I wanted to go through some of the improvements that we have within the user experience. Maybe we'll leave that for another time. So I'm just going to jump into the resources here because I want to get through some of these Q&A questions. There's a number of items here. Definitely go to the Help Center article, the Workspace for Education Storage Guide. There is a resource list at the end of that guide that is jam-packed full of information that I couldn't put into the guide, but I wanted to reference, especially third-party information. I believe there's some GAM scripts in there that Ross Scruggs has kindly created, Python scripts that are super useful, especially when we're talking about shared drives. I've linked to some resources here on Google Takeout that you can share with your users or just to understand. I've linked to some resources in terms of BigQuery, controlling costs, estimating those costs. I've linked to some resources in terms of advanced domain line takeout, what is taken out, what is not, how to use the cost calculator to understand storage costs within GCP, as well as GAM commands to be able to transfer data between buckets. And if your users are interested in understanding what shared drives can do and how it's different than my drives, I've linked to some change management resources related to that. And I want to thank you very much for listening to me drone on for the last hour and 15 minutes. And we're going to move into Q&A, and we're going to lightning round these questions. If you want to stay on, I can stay on for a little bit longer, but I want to make sure I get these questions answered.
Yeah, no, thank you, Ken. And then before you jump into those, again, thank you everyone for attending. Our next session will actually happen on this Thursday. It's going to be around deprovisioning of accounts, and it's going to be hosted. It's our first I2 and customer-led session. It's going to be hosted by Dana Voss from Internet2 and Chuck Boheme from Cornell University, and that's happening again this Thursday on April 6th. And then, yeah, Ariel, you can feel free to cut the recording. We'll dive right into the Q&A. And I will add as well, Ken, before you jump in, any questions